The 10th of April, 1951 marked the moment when President Harry S. Truman's hand trembled slightly as he signed the most controversial military dismissal in American history. General Douglas MacArthur, the legendary five-star general who had accepted Japan's surrender and rebuilt a nation from atomic ashes, stood at the precipice of his greatest humiliation. The man who had walked through the Philippines like a living monument, who had promised, "I shall return," and kept that promise, now faced a firing that would echo through the corridors of power for generations. The tension had been building for months like a storm gathering over the Pacific. MacArthur, serving as Supreme Commander of United Nations forces in Korea, had grown increasingly frustrated with Washington's limited war strategy. He wanted to cross the Yalu River, to bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria, to unleash Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces from Taiwan upon mainland China. President Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff saw something different: the specter of World War III, nuclear apocalypse, and Soviet intervention that could transform a regional conflict into global conflagration. According to the New York Times coverage from April 11, 1951, the dismissal sent shockwaves through America and the world. MacArthur had committed the unforgivable sin in a democracy, a military commander publicly challenging civilian authority. He had written letters to Republican Congressman Joseph Martin, criticizing administration policy. He had issued statements that directly contradicted presidential directives. He had, in essence, conducted his own foreign policy from a command post in Tokyo. The general's hubris had deep roots. At 71 years old, MacArthur had spent more than half a century in uniform. He had served in the Philippines before the First World War, commanded the Rainbow Division in France, where he earned 7 Silver Stars, ruled occupied Japan with unprecedented authority, and masterminded the brilliant Incheon landing that turned the tide of the Korean War in September 1950. He had grown accustomed to adulation, to having his judgments treated as near divine wisdom. But Korea had become a quagmire. After Chinese forces entered the war in late 1950, pushing UN forces back in what MacArthur called an entirely new war, the general's strategic miscalculations became apparent. He had assured Truman that China would not intervene, that the war would be won by Christmas. Instead, American soldiers froze and died in the longest retreat in U.S. military history. Truman's decision was not impulsive. He consulted with Secretary of Defense George Marshall, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. All agreed MacArthur had to go. The principle of civilian control over the military, enshrined in the Constitution, demanded it. On that April morning, the announcement was made. Douglas MacArthur was relieved of all his commands. America erupted. MacArthur was beloved, almost worshipped by millions. Truman's approval ratings plummeted. Republicans called for impeachment, but the deed was done, and the general would return home after 14 years abroad, uncertain of his future, his legend tarnished but far from extinguished. The 19th of April, 1951 witnessed scenes not seen since ancient Rome when victorious generals returned from distant campaigns. Douglas MacArthur's plane touched down at San Francisco International Airport to a reception that resembled religious fervor more than a military welcome. 500,000 people lined the streets, waving flags, holding signs that read, "God bless General MacArthur," and "Oust President Truman." The fired general had become a martyr in the eyes of many Americans who saw his dismissal as weakness, as capitulation to communist aggression. MacArthur understood spectacle and symbolism with the instinct of a born showman. He had spent years cultivating his image: the corncob pipe, the sunglasses, the braided cap, the carefully choreographed wade through Philippine surf. Now he crafted his return with equal precision. He did not rage or condemn. He appeared dignified, wounded, more wronged than wrong. His statement upon landing struck notes of patriotism and sacrifice that resonated across a divided nation. The crescendo came on April 19, 1951, when MacArthur addressed a joint session of Congress. The speech would become legendary, a masterpiece of rhetoric that moved hardened politicians to tears. He defended his Korean strategy, arguing that, in war, there is no substitute for victory. He criticized the administration's policy of limited warfare, warning that it meant prolonged casualties without decisive resolution. Then came the closing, delivered with theatrical perfection. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty, as God gave him the light to see that duty. The chamber erupted in applause that lasted several minutes. Congressmen wept openly. The speech was broadcast on radio and nascent television to millions. Herbert Hoover called it the voice of God. Republican Senator Robert Taft suggested MacArthur run for president. Ticker tape parades in New York City drew 7.5 million people, more than had welcomed Dwight Eisenhower after defeating Nazi Germany. But beneath the adulation, questions simmered. Senate hearings began in May 1951 to investigate the dismissal and MacArthur's strategy. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, delivered devastating testimony, describing MacArthur's proposals as the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. George Marshall, the architect of Allied victory in World War II, supported Truman's decision completely. Slowly, the careful unpacking of MacArthur's strategic errors and insubordination revealed a more complicated picture. The general's political ambitions flickered briefly. He delivered the keynote address at the 1952 Republican National Convention, but his speech was long, rambling, and poorly received. The party nominated Eisenhower instead, MacArthur's former subordinate, a choice that must have stung deeply. The old soldier began to fade indeed, not into obscurity, but into a twilight realm of corporate boards and ceremonial appearances. Yet MacArthur was not finished. His restless mind turned toward an unexpected direction, not politics, not business, but something far more intriguing. He began to receive correspondence from an unlikely source across the Atlantic, where a defeated nation struggled to rebuild not just its cities but its entire military philosophy. The spring of 1955 found Europe still divided by the Iron Curtain, its eastern half suffocating under Soviet control, while the West slowly rebuilt with American Marshall Plan aid. West Germany, the federal republic established in 1949, faced an existential dilemma that kept Chancellor Konrad Adenauer awake through long Bonn nights. The wound of the Second World War remained raw, the shame of Nazi atrocities still fresh, yet the Soviet Union massed divisions in East Germany that could reach the Rhine within days if they chose to invade. The Western Allies had concluded that German rearmament was necessary, a bitter pill for nations that had lost millions defeating German militarism. The Paris Agreements of October 1954 ended the occupation statute and paved the way for West German sovereignty and eventual NATO membership. But how does a nation create an army from scratch, especially when that nation's previous armies had conquered Europe twice and committed genocide? The Bundeswehr, as the new armed forces would be called, needed to be fundamentally different from the Wehrmacht. It required democratic principles, civilian control, and a doctrine that rejected the militarism that had poisoned German culture. The challenge fell to Theodor Blank, whom Adenauer appointed as the first defense commissioner, and a small group of former Wehrmacht officers who had opposed Hitler, including Wolf Graf von Baudissin, Johann Adolf Graf von Kielmansegg, and Ulrich de Maizière. These reformers developed the concept of innere Führung, or inner leadership, a revolutionary approach that envisioned soldiers as citizens in uniform. The German soldier would think critically, understand political context, and refuse illegal orders. This stood in stark contrast to the Prussian tradition of unquestioning obedience that had enabled Nazi crimes. But theory was one thing. Practical military effectiveness was another. The Germans looked abroad for models and advice. They studied American, British, and French military organizations. But they also sought counsel from someone unexpected: Douglas MacArthur. The general's experience rebuilding the Japanese military, his strategic thinking, and ironically his own clash with civilian authority, made him a fascinating subject of study. In June 1955, a German military delegation visited New York, where MacArthur maintained offices in the Waldorf Towers. The meeting was unofficial, arranged through intermediaries and conducted with discretion. The Germans came with questions about how to build military effectiveness while maintaining democratic values, how to train soldiers to be warriors, yet also critical thinkers. MacArthur, now 75, received them with characteristic formality and surprising openness. He spoke of Japan, of how he had helped create the Japanese self-defense forces from nothing, imposing constitutional restrictions on militarism while maintaining capability. He spoke of Korea, of how limited political objectives had handcuffed military operations. But he also spoke, with an honesty that surprised his visitors, about his own failures, his underestimation of Chinese intentions, his certainty that proved catastrophically wrong. The Germans listened carefully, taking notes, probing his thoughts on night operations, defensive doctrine, and the psychological warfare that would characterize any conflict with the Soviet Union. It was during these conversations that MacArthur made an observation that would prove prophetic, and would later be attributed as the origin of a dramatic shift in German military thinking. The autumn of 1955 brought the first recruits into the nascent Bundeswehr, young German men who had been children during the war, who remembered Allied bombs and Soviet invasion, but who now must defend the democratic West. The training facilities were sparse, the equipment often borrowed or obsolete American surplus, but the doctrine being developed was genuinely innovative. MacArthur's conversations with German military planners had touched upon a critical vulnerability in Soviet doctrine. The Red Army, despite its massive size and brutal effectiveness, relied heavily on daylight operations and overwhelming force. Soviet tactical doctrine emphasized mass artillery barrages, waves of tanks and infantry advances conducted with mechanical precision. But this approach had weaknesses, particularly in conditions that disrupted coordination and visibility. The general had experienced this firsthand during his campaigns in the Pacific, where Japanese forces had repeatedly used darkness to offset American firepower superiority. He had seen how night operations confused command structures, neutralized air superiority, and created psychological terror among troops unprepared for close combat in blackness. In Korea, Chinese forces had used similar tactics with devastating effectiveness during their winter offensive. MacArthur suggested during those New York meetings documented in German military archives that a smaller, outnumbered German force might exploit this Soviet weakness. If war came, the Bundeswehr could not match Soviet numbers, but they could transform night into a weapon, becoming what he called darkness specialists who could strike, disrupt, and vanish before Soviet commanders could coordinate responses. The German military reformers seized upon this concept with characteristic thoroughness. Wolfgraf von Baudissin and his colleagues began developing what they internally called Nachtjäger doctrine, or night fighter doctrine. It involved several revolutionary elements: intensive night combat training, small unit independence, emphasis on infiltration rather than frontal assault, and psychological preparation that turned darkness from a source of fear into a tactical advantage. According to documentation from the Bundeswehr Military History Research Office, the doctrine was implemented beginning in 1956. Training exercises shifted increasingly to nocturnal operations. German soldiers learned to navigate by stars, to communicate with minimal sound, to fight in complete darkness using hearing and touch as much as sight. They studied urban night fighting, forest infiltration, and techniques for disrupting enemy formations in darkness. The innovation went beyond tactics. The Germans invested in early night vision technology, developing some of the first practical infrared scopes for infantry use. They trained soldiers in using darkness for concealment, in exploiting the psychological impact of invisible attackers and creating fear through uncertainty. The goal was not merely to fight effectively at night, but to make the night itself frightening to any potential enemy. The psychological component was crucial. Soviet military culture, despite its toughness, had particular vulnerabilities to invisible threats. German planners studied Soviet tactical manuals and noted the emphasis on maintaining formation integrity, on visual command and control, on coordinated movements that required officers to see their units. Strip away visibility, introduce chaos and uncertainty, and the Soviet military machine might stumble. By 1957, NATO observers attending Bundeswehr exercises reported something remarkable. German units performing night operations with skill and confidence that matched or exceeded daylight proficiency. Small German units would disappear into darkness during exercises, infiltrate behind opposing forces and create havoc before melting away. The exercises were nicknamed Geisterkrieg, or Ghost War, by participating troops. MacArthur followed these developments with interest from New York. German military attachés sent him reports and analysis. The old general, sidelined from active command, found vicarious satisfaction in influencing military doctrine halfway around the world. The cold winter of 1958 settled over Central Europe like a shroud, the Berlin crisis simmering as Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev demanded Western forces leave the divided city. Along the inner German border, where democracy met dictatorship, Bundeswehr units conducted exercises that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. German soldiers, members of a reconstructed military, trained to defend against the very ideology that had divided their nation. The night fighter doctrine had evolved beyond theoretical concept into operational reality. Elite Bundeswehr units, particularly mountain and airborne troops, had become extraordinarily proficient in nocturnal operations. Training facilities in the Bavarian Alps and the Eifel region conducted realistic exercises that pushed soldiers to their psychological and physical limits. Men learned to operate for days without sleep, to fight in complete darkness, to overcome the primal human fear of unseen threats. The doctrine's sophistication went beyond individual soldier training. German military planners developed entire operational concepts around nocturnal warfare. Communication systems were adapted for minimal light and sound signatures. Supply operations were scheduled for darkness. Intelligence gathering focused on identifying gaps in Soviet night defensive capabilities. The Bundeswehr was becoming a military force designed to exploit the 24-hour cycle in ways few modern armies had attempted. Soviet military intelligence began noticing. East German sources reported unusual nighttime activity during NATO exercises. Soviet observers attending official military exchanges noted German emphasis on low-light operations. Reports filtered back to Moscow describing a potential tactical approach that could undermine Red Army conventional superiority. The response was telling. Soviet military journals began publishing articles about defending against fascist infiltration tactics and imperialist night raiders. MacArthur, monitoring these developments from his Waldorf Towers residence, corresponded occasionally with German military contacts. His letters, preserved in German military archives, reveal satisfaction with how his suggestions had been implemented and expanded. He wrote in March 1958 to General Johann Adolf Graf von Kielmansegg, "You have taken a simple observation and transformed it into a comprehensive doctrine. The Soviets relied on darkness to shield their movements in Korea. Now you will use darkness to shield yours, but with far greater sophistication." The psychological warfare component of the doctrine matured during this period. German military psychologists studied the impact of invisible threats on soldier morale and unit cohesion. They developed techniques to maximize the terror potential of night operations. Unexpected sounds, evidence of infiltration without immediate attack, psychological operations that played on Soviet soldiers' fears and uncertainties. Reference materials from the Institute for Military Psychology in Bonn from 1959 show extensive research into how darkness amplifies fear, how unseen threats create paranoia, how the loss of visual command and control degrades military effectiveness. The Germans were not merely training to fight at night. They were weaponizing night itself, transforming it from neutral environment into tactical advantage. NATO allies watched with mixed reactions. American commanders appreciated the innovation, but worried about overspecialization. British observers admired the thoroughness, but questioned whether night operations could be sustained during extended conventional warfare. French military analysts saw parallels to their own experiences with Viet Minh night tactics in Indochina, but the Germans pressed forward. By 1959, entire Bundeswehr brigades conducted major exercises predominantly during darkness. Soldiers wore specialized uniforms designed for night operations. Equipment was modified for silent use. Tactics emphasized infiltration, disruption, and psychological impact over holding territory. The capstone demonstration came during NATO exercises in September 1959. A Bundeswehr mountain brigade, operating entirely at night, successfully infiltrated behind a simulated Soviet defensive line, disrupted command posts, and withdrew with minimal casualties. NATO observers were impressed and somewhat unnerved. The German military, barely a decade after its total defeat, had developed tactical capabilities that made it genuinely formidable despite relatively small size. The decade turned to 1960, and Douglas MacArthur entered his ninth decade while the Bundeswehr matured into a confident military force integrated within NATO's defensive structure. The night fighter doctrine had become institutionalized, taught at military academies and refined through constant training. German soldiers earned quiet recognition among NATO allies as specialists in conditions that other forces found challenging. MacArthur's direct influence had faded as years passed, but his initial observations had spawned something larger than he perhaps anticipated. The doctrine had evolved through German military culture's characteristic thoroughness into a comprehensive approach to warfare that challenged conventional assumptions. Young Bundeswehr officers wrote dissertations analyzing nocturnal tactical advantages. Equipment manufacturers developed specialized night combat technology. The German military had found a distinctive identity that reconciled democratic values with military effectiveness. The psychological impact extended beyond military circles. Soviet military planners had to account for a new variable in their war scenarios. The numerical advantage enjoyed by Warsaw Pact forces was still decisive in any conventional conflict, but the Germans had introduced uncertainty. If conflict came, Soviet commanders would face an enemy that grew more dangerous when darkness fell, that could appear behind lines, that transformed night from rest period into vulnerability. German civilians remained largely unaware of these developments. The Bundeswehr maintained a deliberately low profile, conscious of lingering anti-militarist sentiment. But within military circles, pride grew quietly. The German soldier was no longer defined by Wehrmacht aggression or SS atrocities, but by professional competence, democratic values, and tactical innovation. MacArthur himself reflected on these developments in a 1961 interview with military historian Russell Weigley. He acknowledged that his firing had been constitutionally necessary, that civilian control over military was essential in democracy. But he also spoke with satisfaction about continuing to contribute, about ideas finding implementation even after formal command ended. He said, according to Whaley's notes, "I was removed from command, but I was not removed from thinking, from advising, from contributing where my experience might prove useful." The night fighter doctrine faced its first realistic test during Berlin Wall construction in August 1961. While the crisis remained political rather than military, Bundeswehr units were placed on high alert. Their nighttime readiness exercises along the border demonstrated capabilities that Soviet commanders observed carefully. East German reports from that period, released after reunification, revealed genuine concern about German night infiltration capabilities. MacArthur followed the crisis from New York with the intensity of a man whose life had been defined by such moments. He was 81, his health declining, but his mind remained sharp. He understood that the peaceful resolution of Berlin demonstrated deterrence working. The Soviets knew that any military action would face not just American nuclear threats, but also a capable German military that could make conventional invasion costly. The doctrine continued evolving through the early 1960s. New technology enhanced capabilities, better night vision equipment, silent communication systems, specialized weapons designed for close combat in darkness. Training became even more sophisticated, incorporating lessons from American Special Forces experience in Southeast Asia and British counterinsurgency operations. But the deeper legacy was cultural and philosophical. The Bundeswehr had proven that a democratic military could be effective without surrendering to authoritarianism, that soldiers could think critically while remaining disciplined, that innovation could come from intellectual rigor rather than martial tradition. MacArthur's initial suggestions about night operations had provided the spark, but German military reformers had built something genuinely new. By 1963, the night fighter doctrine was no longer novel but established. NATO doctrine incorporated German night operations expertise. Allied forces trained with Bundeswehr units to learn techniques. The Germans, once defeated and disarmed, had become teachers, offering tactical innovations that strengthened the alliance defending against Soviet expansion. MacArthur, increasingly frail, rarely traveled now, but he maintained correspondence with several German officers, following the evolution of ideas he had helped plant. In his final years, this connection to German military development provided satisfaction that his career had mattered beyond battlefield victories and political controversies. The winter of 1963 brought biting cold to New York, and Douglas MacArthur, now 83, felt the weight of his years settling upon him like snow accumulating on the Waldorf Tower's roof. His public appearances had become rare, though his mind remained sharp and his memories vivid. He lived surrounded by the artifacts of a remarkable life: photographs with presidents and emperors, medals from a dozen nations, maps of campaigns that had shaped the 20th century. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in November 1963 shook MacArthur deeply. He had known Kennedy, had advised him briefly during the early days of his administration, particularly regarding Southeast Asia. The general had warned against becoming entangled in Vietnam's jungles, drawing on his Pacific War experience. Kennedy had listened respectfully, but pursued his own course. Now that young president was gone, and America was sliding toward the very quagmire MacArthur had predicted, German military delegations still visited occasionally, bringing updates on Bundeswehr developments and seeking the old general's perspectives. In February 1964, Colonel Hans Speidel, who had been Erwin Rommel's chief of staff and now served as a senior Bundeswehr commander, spent an afternoon with MacArthur. They discussed how the night fighter doctrine had matured, how it had influenced broader NATO tactical thinking, how German soldiers now trained others in techniques that MacArthur's observations had inspired. According to Speidel's memoir published in 1971, MacArthur was simultaneously proud and philosophical about his indirect influence on German military development. He remarked, "I never commanded German soldiers, yet perhaps I contributed to their doctrine. History is strange in its connections, in how ideas flow across borders and generations. I was fired for insubordination, yet my thinking found implementation in the military of our former enemy." The general's health deteriorated through early 1964. He entered Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington in March, suffering from biliary cirrhosis. The Army provided updates on his condition, and well-wishers sent thousands of letters and telegrams. President Lyndon Johnson visited, as did many senior military officers. MacArthur's condition stabilized briefly, allowing him moments of lucidity amid increasing weakness. During these final weeks, MacArthur reportedly spoke often of his career's contradictions: the victories and defeats, the glory and humiliation, the certainty that had often proved misplaced. He had been right about many things and catastrophically wrong about others. He had been both visionary and stubborn, both brilliant and blind. His firing had been humiliating but perhaps necessary, a democratic check on military authority that preserved principles he claimed to defend. On April 5, 1964, Douglas MacArthur died at Walter Reed, surrounded by family. He was 84 years old. President Johnson ordered a state funeral, and the nation paused to honor a controversial but undeniably significant figure. His body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, and thousands filed past to pay respects. The funeral cortege moved through Washington streets lined with silent crowds, a final procession for a man who had loved ceremony and symbolism. The obituaries were extensive and complex, wrestling with MacArthur's contradictory legacy. The New York Times ran a lengthy piece acknowledging his military brilliance while noting his political failures and strategic miscalculations. The Washington Post examined his Pacific War achievements and Korean War controversies with equal weight. European newspapers, including German publications, noted his unexpected influence on Bundeswehr development, his transformation from fired general to informal advisor to former enemies. In West Germany, military newspapers published tributes acknowledging MacArthur's indirect but meaningful contribution to German military reconstruction. Defense Minister Kai-Uwe von Hassel issued a statement recognizing that American military thinking, including MacArthur's observations, had helped shape the Bundeswehr's distinctive character. The night fighter doctrine, though not publicly discussed in detail during the Cold War, had become a quiet source of capability and confidence. MacArthur was buried in Norfolk, Virginia, his mother's hometown, in a relatively simple ceremony that contrasted with the elaborate state funeral. The man who had lived for grand gestures, who had crafted his public image with theatrical care, found final rest in understated dignity. But his influence persisted, particularly in unexpected places. The Bundeswehr continued refining night operations techniques through the remainder of the Cold War. German military doctrine incorporated the psychological and tactical advantages of darkness, creating specialized units whose capabilities made Soviet planners nervous and NATO commanders confident. The late 1960s brought new challenges to the Bundeswehr as the Vietnam War raged and student protests questioned military institutions throughout the West. Yet the German military, insulated somewhat by its democratic reforms and low public profile, continued developing the capabilities that had become its distinctive contribution to NATO defense. The night fighter doctrine reached full maturity during this period. A generation of Bundeswehr officers who had trained exclusively under the new doctrine now reached command positions. These officers, too young to remember the Wehrmacht, embodied the synthesis of democratic values and military effectiveness that reformers had envisioned. They expanded night operations capabilities while maintaining the critical thinking and civilian accountability that defined citizens in uniform. Technological advances enhanced the doctrine's effectiveness. Improved night vision equipment, developed partially through Bundeswehr specifications, allowed German soldiers to see in conditions that rendered other forces nearly blind. Silent communication systems enabled coordination without sound signatures that might betray positions. Specialized weapons and equipment designed specifically for nocturnal combat gave German units capabilities that exceeded their modest size. The psychological warfare components became increasingly sophisticated. Bundeswehr intelligence units studied Soviet military psychology extensively, identifying specific vulnerabilities to exploit during night operations. They developed scenarios for creating maximum disruption and fear through minimal force, understanding that psychological impact often mattered more than casualty counts in deterrence. NATO exercises during this period consistently demonstrated German night operations superiority. During a major exercise in 1968, a Bundeswehr brigade operating predominantly at night successfully defeated a much larger Allied force in a defensive scenario. Post-exercise analysis revealed that the German unit's ability to maneuver and strike effectively in darkness had offset significant numerical disadvantages. American, British, and French commanders took note, incorporating lessons into their own training. Warsaw Pact sources examined after the Cold War ended reveal significant Soviet concern about German night capabilities during this period. Soviet military doctrine was modified to address infiltration tactics and darkness exploitation. Additional resources were devoted to night defensive measures and counter-infiltration training. The Bundeswehr, though much smaller than Soviet forces, had achieved a deterrent effect through specialized capability. The doctrine's influence extended beyond Germany. NATO established night operations training centers, where German instructors taught techniques to Allied forces. American Special Forces, preparing for Vietnam operations, trained with Bundeswehr mountain units to learn infiltration and silent movement techniques. British commandos exchanged expertise with German airborne units. The fired American generals' initial observations had spawned capabilities that strengthened the entire Western alliance. Young Bundeswehr officers began publishing theoretical work, analyzing the philosophy underlying night operations doctrine. These writings explored how darkness fundamentally changed tactical dynamics, how it shifted advantages from larger to smaller forces, from conventional to unconventional approaches. German military journals featured sophisticated analyses of nocturnal combat psychology, command and control challenges, and technological requirements. The broader German military culture absorbed these developments. The Bundeswehr became known within NATO circles as serious, professional, and distinctively capable in specific domains. The shame of Wehrmacht atrocities and Nazi militarism gave way to quiet pride in democratic military service. Young Germans who entered military service found an institution that valued intelligence and initiative, that trained them to think critically while maintaining discipline. By 1970, the night fighter doctrine was no longer experimental, but established orthodoxy. Every Bundeswehr soldier received significant night operations training. Elite units specialized in conditions that would paralyze other forces. Equipment procurement prioritized capabilities that enhanced nocturnal effectiveness. The doctrine had become inseparable from institutional identity. Critics occasionally questioned the emphasis on night operations, arguing that it was too specialized, that it might create vulnerabilities in conventional daylight warfare. But proponents noted that the doctrine's real value was psychological and tactical flexibility. It expanded operational possibilities, created uncertainty for potential enemies, and provided capabilities disproportionate to force size. The 1970s brought détente between superpowers but continued tension along the inner German border, where the Berlin Wall stood as concrete testament to division. The Bundeswehr maintained constant readiness, knowing that any conflict would transform German territory into a battleground within hours. The night fighter doctrine evolved to address this specific geographic and strategic reality. Border units developed specialized techniques for operating in the particular terrain along the divide between East and West Germany. The heavily forested regions, urban areas around Berlin, and the complex topography of central Germany provided ideal conditions for the infiltration tactics that had become German specialties. Training exercises simulated realistic scenarios, Soviet breakthrough attempts, penetration of defensive lines, operations behind enemy formations. Intelligence gathering took on particular importance. Bundeswehr reconnaissance units, often operating under darkness, mapped Soviet positions, identified command facilities, located communications nodes. This intelligence, shared throughout NATO, proved invaluable for defensive planning. The Germans knew their own territory intimately and had developed unmatched capabilities for moving through it unseen. The psychological impact of these capabilities extended beyond military calculations. East German soldiers manning the border reported hearing sounds at night, encountering evidence of infiltration, experiencing the unsettling awareness of being watched from darkness. These experiences, documented in Stasi files released after reunification, created constant unease that degraded morale and effectiveness. Soviet commanders respected German night capabilities enough to modify defensive doctrines specifically to address them. Additional resources were devoted to perimeter security, night defensive measures, and counter-infiltration. These defensive investments, while prudent, absorbed resources that might otherwise have been directed toward offensive capabilities. The Bundeswehr's specialized doctrine achieved strategic effects disproportionate to German military size. During the Cold War's tense moments, particularly the 1973 Yom Kippur War and subsequent Middle East crises, Bundeswehr readiness demonstrated capabilities that reassured NATO allies and concerned Warsaw Pact planners. German units mobilized quickly, moved to defensive positions efficiently, and demonstrated the capacity to operate effectively around the clock. The night operations training that had seemed specialized proved broadly valuable during high alert periods. The doctrine continued evolving technologically. New night vision systems provided capabilities approaching daylight visibility. Thermal imaging allowed detection of enemy forces regardless of light conditions. Silent communication systems enabled coordination across dispersed units. German defense industries, working closely with Bundeswehr requirements, developed equipment that set NATO standards. But technology alone did not define the doctrine's success. The psychological preparation, the cultural acceptance of darkness as tactical advantage rather than obstacle, the training that made night operations routine rather than exceptional, these intangibles mattered most. Bundeswehr soldiers operated at night with confidence that Soviet soldiers, despite superior numbers, could not match. Young Germans entering military service during this period found the night fighter doctrine so integrated into training and culture that many did not realize its relatively recent origins or its connection to an American general's observations 20 years earlier. It had become simply how the Bundeswehr operated, an assumed component of military identity. Historians and military theorists began examining the doctrine's development. Academic studies analyzed how MacArthur's initial suggestions had been transformed through German military culture into comprehensive capabilities. The case became a study in military innovation, in how ideas cross cultural boundaries, in how defeat can paradoxically enable reform impossible for victors constrained by successful traditions. By 1979, the Berlin Wall's 20th anniversary, the Bundeswehr had become a mature, confident military force that NATO relied upon for specific capabilities. The night operations expertise that had begun with a fired general's observations had evolved into institutional excellence that served alliance defense. Germany, divided and occupied just 30 years earlier, now contributed essential capabilities to Western security. The 1980s brought the Cold War's final phase, the decade when Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms began unraveling communist control. Throughout this period, the Bundeswehr maintained its distinctive capabilities, ready for a conflict that thankfully never came. The night fighter doctrine, now a mature and proven approach, remained central to German military identity and NATO defensive planning. The doctrine's true test came not through combat, but through its deterrent effect. Soviet military planners, when developing scenarios for potential Western invasion, consistently identified German night operations capabilities as significant complications. The prospect of facing an enemy that grew more dangerous after dark, that could infiltrate and disrupt with minimal warning, that transformed territorial gains into vulnerability, these considerations made aggressive action less attractive. Deterrence worked not through matching Soviet strength, but through creating specific, costly problems that any invasion would face. As the Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989, Bundeswehr soldiers watched from their posts along the border that suddenly meant something different. The defensive preparations, the night operations training, the constant readiness, all had been necessary precisely because they had made conflict less likely. The doctrine developed from MacArthur's observations had contributed to winning the Cold War without firing shots, a paradoxical but genuine form of military success. German reunification in 1990 brought enormous challenges, including integrating East German military personnel into the Bundeswehr. Former National People's Army soldiers encountered the night fighter doctrine with mixed reactions. Some found it sophisticated and impressive. Others, remembering nervous nights on border duty, experienced uncomfortable recognition of what they had faced from the other side of the fence. The doctrine adapted to post-Cold War realities. As the Bundeswehr transitioned from territorial defense to expeditionary operations, night operations capabilities proved valuable in new contexts. German forces deployed to the Balkans, Afghanistan, and other crisis zones brought expertise that complemented Allied capabilities. The techniques developed for deterring Soviet invasion found application in peacekeeping, counterinsurgency, and stabilization operations. Military historians examining the Cold War's outcome increasingly recognized the night fighter doctrine's contribution to NATO effectiveness. Academic studies published in the 1990s and early 21st century analyzed how the Bundeswehr's specialized capabilities had strengthened deterrence, how tactical innovation by a smaller ally had enhanced overall defense, how MacArthur's observations had been transformed into lasting institutional excellence. The broader legacy extended beyond military tactics. The Bundeswehr's experience demonstrated that innovation could come from defeat, that former enemies could become trusted allies, that military effectiveness did not require sacrificing democratic values. The development of the night fighter doctrine, from initial American suggestions through German implementation to NATO-wide influence, illustrated how ideas evolve through international cooperation. Douglas MacArthur, dead since 1964, was occasionally remembered in this context. German military historians writing about the doctrine's origins noted his contribution without exaggeration. He had made observations that sparked German thinking, but the Germans had done the creative work of developing comprehensive doctrine. He had been catalyst rather than creator, important, but not singular. The connection between America's fired general and Germany's night fighters remained obscure outside military circles. It was not a story of clear causation, but of complex influence, of ideas crossing borders and evolving through different cultural contexts. MacArthur had suggested possibilities. German military reformers had built reality. By the 21st century's second decade, the Bundeswehr's distinctive night operations capabilities remained relevant even as warfare evolved. Special forces worldwide studied German techniques. NATO doctrine still incorporated principles developed through decades of German innovation. The legacy persisted not as museum piece but as living practice, constantly adapted to new challenges. The ultimate irony was not lost on thoughtful observers. The general America fired for insubordination had influenced German military development more meaningfully than many generals who never faced dismissal. His firing had freed him from command responsibilities, but not from thinking, from observing, from contributing where his experience found receptive audience. The shame of 1951 had become, through unexpected channels, a source of lasting influence. Germany, defeated utterly in 1945, had built a democratic military that earned respect through specialized excellence rather than feared through conquest. The night that once witnessed Wehrmacht atrocities now belonged to soldiers who defended democracy, who operated under rule of law, who embodied values their predecessors had violated. The transformation was profound and hard-won. MacArthur's story thus ended not in bitter retirement or political vindication, but in quiet, indirect influence on military development he never directly controlled. He had been right about some things and wrong about others, brilliant in some moments and blind in others, but ultimately consequential in ways he never fully knew. The general America fired had indeed made Germany fear the dark, but a different Germany than he had fought, and for different reasons than anyone expected, creating shadows that served peace rather than conquest.